Hello, I'm Dango Rose. Welcome to the Mountaineer Podcast, where everybody's listening. The Mountaineer brings you the latest news of the Peak to Peak region, in print, online, through our podcast, social media, and special publications. Now, listen in to the latest news of the area with our local journalists.
Hello, my name is Jamie Lammers, and welcome to a very special edition of the Mountaineer Podcast, where we're celebrating National Poetry Month with a special guest. Do you mind introducing yourself real quick?
My name is Alexander Shalom Joseph. I'm a writer and a carpenter. I live up in the mountains, and I send a poem every week to the Mountaineer.
And your column is called Poetry Corner, correct?
Yes, I guess so. I think initially it was called, I started it in 2019. It was called Some Words for the Week, and then at some point somehow it got changed to Poetry Corner.
So when did poetry become such an important part of your life, and why is it such an important part of your life?
There's a lot there. I think I started writing poetry in 2015 pretty regularly. I was given a prompt to write a poem. I was doing a class about eco-psychology. I'd never written poetry before. I'd always loved reading and enjoyed writing essays, but I was given a prompt writing a poem about my ancestors. I kind of thought it was a joke, but then I got really into it, and I was like, wow, this is really meaningful to me, and it was really, I cried when I was writing it. I just felt really moved, and then I started writing poems pretty much every day. And I write poems most days. I also write fiction, so sometimes my energy goes into that. That's kind of when I started, and now I have 2 books of poetry out. Both of them are kind of about nature, and the first one is called Our Mother the Mountain, which is about living in the mountains. It's like a calendar year of living up in the mountains. And the second one is Broken Light in a Burning Wood, and it's about climate change and the forest fires that we have and trying to find lightness in the darkness that is climate change. So I find a lot of inspiration living up in the mountains, and I also find a lot of inspiration writing poems for our local community. I grew up here. I was at Naropa in Boulder, their MFA program, which is a Master's in Fine Arts. I was getting that Master's in Poetry, and I was finding that the poetry of Naropa and of academia was very insular and obscure, and I was like, I want to write poems for people that I grew up with, people that I work construction with, people that I went to high school with. I want to write poems for the mountain community or for the everyday person, notice nature around them, to rethink themselves in some way. And so I emailed Barb. I went to high school, or actually I grew up with her son, kind of knew her, and I said, hey, this is who I am. Love to write poems for the paper. And she was like, great. So that's kind of how that started. And it's been an honor to be able to write poetry about the mountains for the mountain community the last 4.5 years.
So you mentioned you started in the Mountaineer around 2019?
Yeah, so I was in a class in 2019. I think actually it was a little bit before. I'm kind of confused about the timeline. Initially, I sent 1 poem and we made it to Poetry Corner. And then during COVID in 2020, I moved up here in March of 2020. I moved out of Boulder and moved back up into the mountains, started renovating this cabin and hunkered down here for the last many years. And around that time, it was maybe the second day of COVID, I emailed Barb again and I was like, I want to have a regular poetry column, because I'd sent a couple poems before that. So yeah, March of 2020 is when the official Words for the Week poetry column started, but before that I'd sent sporadic poetry in. That makes sense.
I've been around since April of 2019, so it's kind of cool to hear we started it around the same time.
Yeah, I think my first poem could have been around April 2019. I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, I think you predate me a little bit. But I grew up here, but I haven't been submitting poems for that long.
Had you been involved in the Mountaineer at all before then?
I think when I was 5, there was a picture of me dressed up as Harry Potter on the front page, maybe 6, but that was kind of the extent of my involvement.
Are there any particular poets or poems that have really inspired you over the years?
Yes, definitely. I started by reading a lot of Charles Bukowski. He's a big inspiration. I have a very complex relationship with him because some of his themes and his writing is offensive to me, and some of it is so meaningful and heartfelt and deeper than anything I've read from other poets, and really interested and committed to writing poems that anybody can read. I find that he's really good at that. I think people like Jim Harrison is another poet that was very simple in his writing but very beautiful. Philip Levine is another one that I really like. Trying to think. Andrea Gibson, who's I think the current poet laureate of Colorado, lives in Boulder. She was a huge inspiration. She's more of a spoken word poet. She may use they pronouns. So she was a huge inspiration initially when I was starting up, but my style is very different than the really loud, sing-songy spoken word stuff. So those were huge inspirations for me. I'm trying to think. I'm sitting surrounded by books right now, and I can't think of a single book. There's so many. To be cliche, there's a poem about Bluebird written by Charles Bukowski. And that was one of the first poems that I read, and I was like, oh, it can be simple and write a poem that everybody can understand. And it can still make somebody cry. It can still be really powerful. If that makes any sense. That's been my goal. Another person is Mike Parker, who works at the Rock Shop in Ned. He's been a huge mentor for me, and he's a poet and has been forever. And just like listening to him talk about nature, talk about poetry as a way of life has really been inspirational for me.
I had to mention to Alexander that Mike Parker actually recommended him as a poet when I interviewed him last year. Hopefully, that interview will be up by the time this interview is, so you can check out the episode with Mike Parker's interview as well.
It's an honor. He's too nice to me. He's a legend.
Is there anything in particular you want readers of your poetry to take away when they read it?
Yes. I think when I'm writing a poem, I'm often not thinking about what I want it to be about. It's more just happening. I'll see something, try to unpack what it means to me through parse language, or try to pay attention in a new way. Good poetry these days is a way to be present. I guess that's what I want the reader to experience as well. Specifically for the poems that I send to the Mountaineer, I hope that my life in the mountains, that often feels very solitary, can feel more communal through reading these poems for me and for other people. I don't know if I'm explaining it very well, but for example, I wrote a poem maybe 6 months ago for the paper about the 4th of July and how when I was growing up, I used to go gather at Teens Inc., the teen center in the baseball field, and we'd watch the fireworks over the lake, and how that doesn't happen anymore. And how every time I drive to the post office down to Boulder, I see that field and I feel this longing for youth, but also those communal moments when we were able to celebrate something together. And one of my neighbors ran into her and we were talking about poetry. She didn't know that I was the one who wrote the poems for the paper. And she was like, yeah, there was this great poem this week about the fireworks, and I sent it to my family because we used to go together. And I was like, hey, this is what I want. People to reflect on their lives and reflect on our community. There's another time Barb emailed me and said, hey, we have a letter for you at Brightwood Music, and went in and it was a letter from a reader of the Mountaineer who's over 100 years old, and she was just like, I liked your poem about the spider and not killing it. That was really cool. She said something far formal than that. Basically, I liked your poem about the spider. I've experienced that too. Please send me 3 copies. And I was just like, good. People are resonating with it. They've had these experiences before, making them think and also feel not as alone in their experiences. I guess to keep rambling a little bit, I live in Gilpin, and I was driving to work down in Netherland and then in Boulder sometimes. And there was a crow that I don't know how this happened, but a crow had died and fell into a tree by Los Lagos area. It was upside down, dead in this tree. Every time I drove past it, I was like, that is so bizarre. And I kind of was like, is anybody else seeing this? Am I crazy? And so I wrote a poem about it, and a couple people who know that I'm the one who writes the poems texted me or texted my mom. They were like, thank you. We saw the bird too, and we were wondering if anybody else saw that. So I just think we have these experiences. We see animals, we see sunsets, we have these things that have come and gone in the mountains, and I think it's cool to commemorate those for our community.
Just out of curiosity, with the one neighbor you talked to, did you ever tell her that you were the one who wrote that poem?
No. I was just like, that's cool. Maybe I'll check out the paper this week. Sometimes I like to be just curious. Mike Parker is so humble in his way of being a poet and being poetic. I've really taken a lot of notes from him, just being like, cool, I'm glad you're appreciating poetry. It's not about me, it's about poems.
What is particularly inspiring to you about being a part of a poetry community and being able to write and publish your own poetry?
Yeah, I think that poetry and writing in general is a way to pull things out of your subconscious. I mean, clearly if it's part of your subconscious, maybe you don't know it's there. Sometimes it's part of your conscious. I think that you're pulling stuff out of yourself, and sometimes doing that, you're reopening a wound, or you're healing a wound, you're pulling a splinter out of yourself. I know that's sort of metaphorical, but sometimes I have a hard time explaining my feelings until I write a poem about it. Sometimes that poem will start off about this bird that's pecking at the grass in my yard, and then all of a sudden I'm thinking about how much time I've spent in the mountains and how grateful I am for my house. And I think poetry, especially poetry about nature and poetry that's simple, is an entry point for healing. I guess one thing that's become important to me lately, very recently, is I've taught a lot. I taught at Ned High School for a little while, for like less than a year. I taught in colleges, but I just recently, this past weekend, was my first time actually. I went and taught at 2 prisons in Denver, 2 workshops about writing. And I think a big part of why I wanted to do that was just because I've found that writing has been so deeply healing for me. And it's also helped me make sense of my life, be more aware and grateful of my surroundings. I wanted to be able to share that with people who are locked up and also have had hard lives. And so I think right now that's really on my mind, the healing power of poetry and writing. So yeah, it's great for everybody.
Is there anything else you'd like to add before we sign off?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder a lot about the value of poetry in our modern society. I guess this interview is for Poetry Month. I guess it's a time to reflect a little bit on what is the value of poetry. Some people are like, oh, all songs are poems. I disagree with that. I think songs are their own thing. Maybe they evolved from poems. But I think music makes a song different. People are reading less than ever. But I also think that poetry has become very involuted. But for many cultures throughout time, poets, this great line from Isaac Bashevis Singer, who's a famous Jewish Yiddish writer. He said, in most times in history, there's been no distinction between the poet and the prophet. And if we think about poetry, like the Odyssey or a lot of some Psalms or any of these things, any of these great things that have existed in our time, Shakespeare, poetry has encapsulated our time. There are different times in the world. And I just think that poetry, especially with our limited attention spans that everybody talks about, I think there's maybe a time that poetry can be meaningful again. I think on Instagram, there's people who write very simple poetry, Rupi Kaur, who I have mixed feelings about, but she's obviously resonating with people because she's like a multimillionaire and has sold more books than the Bible or something. I think poetry can really tap into the soul of humanity in a way that maybe nothing else can. I'm not trying to toot my own horn. I'm just trying to promote poetry, I guess. I guess the last thing is that James Baldwin, famous writer, poet, said that there's something gravely wrong with a society that doesn't pay attention to the poet's report. So I try to do my own version of a poet's report each week in the Mountaineer, whether it's complaining about the snow or trying to notice stuff that I see while I'm driving to work. But I think that there's something important in the poet's report, and I would encourage everybody to try to write a little poem about what they see, because it's very valuable for ourselves and for each other. I'm trying to look and see, maybe I can see if I wrote a poem today that I can send. I probably write 2 or 3 poems a day. Some of them are crap, maybe all of them. No. I wrote one at 7:23 this morning as I was driving from Home Depot to a job site that I was going to. This is unshared. Who knows? It might appear in the paper this week, but I'm not sure. It started, I was driving down the street in a truck. There was a tree and there was a plastic bag hanging from the tree. And for a second, kind of looked like a Dementor from Harry Potter. It looked creepy. And I was like, oh, whoa, that's a creepy looking plastic bag. And so I was like, oh, all of a sudden I was like, okay, I'm going to write a poem about that. So here it is. Threaded plastic bag suspended in a leafless tree above the road. Looks like some floating cloaked figure or even death itself as I wait for the light to change. Ironic, though, that I could mistake this material, this crude oil byproduct, in everything as dead. For we are much more mortal than it. In plastic bags, like airborne jellyfish, will float this world forever, for at least much longer than us. I don't know about the line about the floating jellyfish. I think if I were to send that into the newspaper, I might sit with it a little longer, but you're getting an insight into the process. It's been an honor to write poems for a newspaper for this long. I'll say the first 2 years, I did it for free. Now I get paid $20 a month to write the poems. So I have sold out. I try to use that $20 on something exciting every month, my poetry money.
I couldn't help but mention some of the poets that Mike Parker recommended along with Alexander during my interview with him last year.
Leaf Running Rabbit, Mike Parker, Hulk Holmgren, and I have all been published by a man named David Martin, who used to live in Ward, now lives in Beulah, Colorado, which is by Pueblo. He has a press called Middle Creek Press, puts out Colorado and Western nature-based poetry. And so he's put out 2 of my books. He's put out maybe like 4 of Mike Parker, 2 of Hoag's, 1 of Leaf. So he's thinking about doing some sort of documentary about the Indian Peaks poets or something like that. But I think, again, it's an honor to be included in this group of poets that are writing in this area. It would be cool if they sold our books all in the same place. I've been trying to get my books in some place. This is my last pitch. I know there's so many things that could end. I haven't been able to find a place that will sell my books in town. It's not that I'm trying to make money. I have a job. I don't really care about that in terms of poetry. I just want the community to be able to access it. But I'm like, how do I get them out there? So anyone listening to this wants to have my books at their place. I brought it to so many places and everyone was like, no. So I was like, okay. Maybe this will spur somebody to be like, hey, we'll carry it at the gas station. Great. I'd love to have my poetry at the gas station. Maybe I'll go in there and see if they want to carry it. If I can plug one thing, join my newsletter. Go to my website, alexandershalomjoseph.com, and put your email in there, and then you can get information about what I'm doing with my writing. Because I have a novella that came out this year, and I'd love to keep anybody who's interested updated on my writing.
Thank you so much to Alexander for coming on board and joining us for the podcast for this very special edition celebrating National Poetry Month. Be sure to check out his weekly poetry in the paper, and be sure to keep an eye out for other highlights from National Poetry Month this year, including an interview with Scott Harrison and an interview with Mike Parker. The poem that Alexander read in this episode is not available in the Mountaineer newspaper. However, you can check out many more poems from Alexander Shalom Joseph at alexandershalomjoseph.com or in Poetry Corner for the Mountain Ear. You can also check out an early episode of the podcast, episode 14 to be precise, to see an earlier interview with Alexander Joseph.
And that's it for our show. Subscribe online to get more access to more news, weekly updates to our community calendar, and a link to our YouTube channel by visiting themountaineer.com. Be sure to use the coupon code PODCAST when subscribing for a 10% discount, only available to our listeners. If you are in the local Peak-to-Peak area, be sure to pick up a print edition of The Mountaineer at a local business. I'm Dango Rose. Thank you for listening.